This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. But the first time I ever heard that piece of classical music, Ozzy Osbourne. He was opening up his concerts with that. True. First time I ever heard it. I still love it. It makes me want to get that adrenaline boost, go knock someone on the ass, so to speak. Not physically. I would never do anything like that. Of course not. Intellectually. And that's where I want to go today. Knocking someone on their ass intellectually. Because if I've noticed one thing over the course of the last 12 months, a good number of people around the world have forgot how to think. They have no clue how to think. It's logical fallacies on top of logical fallacies. It's ad hominems, upside and downside, confirmation bias. People are seriously upside down, lost in their head with no clue. They don't know where the ground is. They don't know where the air is. They're just floating. Excuses, the inability to make decisions. It's sort of frightening. And on top of that, we have social media overload. And soon enough, our society that has all of these issues going on will strap on VR helmets. And who the hell knows where we're headed next once that starts. My guest today, well, he's not actually my guest today. An excerpt I want to play today is from the philosopher Dan Dennett. And Dan is very good about the philosophy of thinking. Thinking about tools that can help us to sure as hell make sense of the mess that surrounds us all. Because a good number of people have absolutely no clue. You can't even get to the point of making a good investment or understanding if this particular advisor might know what's up or might not know what's up unless you can think. And thinking is not genetic. It's learned. So without further ado, let me introduce Dan Dennett. Let me let him talk a little bit about thinking and tools for thinking. I might occasionally interject in a few places to add context to my world.
I'm going to talk about tools for thinking. My book is called Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking. But I'm going to be really talking about tools for thinking. A former student of mine once said, you can't do much carpentry with your bare hands, and you can't do much thinking with your bare brain. That's as good as the motto of my work these days. I'm looking at the tools for thinking that we all add to our basic born with equipment, the native bare brains that we're born with, and the role that that plays in enhancing our powers, our capacities to understand. The book, Tools for Intuition Pumps, is a collection of tools. Now, here's a chicken-egg puzzle. Do tools evolve and make us smarter? Or do we evolve to become smart enough to make tools? And like most evolutionary chicken-egg puzzles, the answer is yes. It goes both ways. In fact, Stan was just talking about the neuroanatomical differences between us and even our closest relatives, chimpanzees. We have these great, long, interconnecting neurons, which are really quite special. What drove their evolution in our brains? I would say what drove that was the advent of human culture and language, which gave the brain a flood of new opportunities, but also a flood of new problems. So I see a coevolution between cultural evolution and genetic evolution, explaining the tremendous difference between our minds and the minds of really any other animal. Yes, I am pushing the human exceptionalist button, and I am pushing it deliberately, and I am not saying that we are outside the realm of science, I'm going to give a sketch of a scientific account of how our minds are exceptional and why. Now, some of you know about the Flynn effect. IQ has gone up dramatically in the last century. Why? Well, Flynn thinks it has to do with human culture, and I think he's right. The thing is, words are tools, and once you've got words and you know how to use them, you have increased your competence in many ways. There's lots of different kinds of tools that are, what are they made of? They're not made of wood and steel. They're informational systems. They're structures, they're habits, they're routines that we learn, whether it's long division or alphabetizing a list. There are many. Each of you are equipped with literally hundreds and hundreds of culturally born thinking tools that enhance your capacity to think.
Let me interject. Tools for investing. The vast majority of the audience, the population out there, does not have a tool, a system, a model for dealing with the markets. Absolutely none, other than to trust some passive buy and hold index that will hopefully work okay by the time you so-called retire. Back to Dan Dennett.
I'm going to add a few to them to your kit today. And what I call intuition pumps, these are rather elaborate tools. These are thought experiments that extend your imagination, but there are also many intuition pumps which cloud your imagination, and I'm very critical of those. But I want to give you a few good examples. I'm going to start with a very simple tool. It's called the Surely alarm. I want you in the future, every time you see the word surely in a text, I want a little bell to ring. Ding! That little bell alerts you to the fact that the author has just used the word surely, and this is very often, not always, very often the weakest point in the argument. Why? Well, the author is telling you something that you're supposed to accept, but it doesn't go without saying. If it did, he wouldn't have said it. It's got to be said, but the author doesn't want to bother arguing for it, so he nudges and says, surely. That's a very good place to drive a wedge. It doesn't always work, but if you just get in the habit of having that little bell ring when you see the word surely, you'll discover a lot of weaknesses in a lot of arguments, not just in philosophy or science, but in politics. Now, I think we should have a little practice with the surely alarm. So, suppose you have a cup of coffee and you're going to put milk in it, and you want to keep the coffee warm as long as possible. So, with the milk in it, so surely you should wait and put the milk in as late as possible, right? I didn't hear any ding. Surely you should ding. Okay, all right. When it comes to the Middle East, if the choice is between stability of government or democracy, well, surely democracy. Thank you. Now, what have I just done? I've just downloaded an app to your necktop. I get letters from people saying, how do I turn the surely alarm off? And the point is, no, you leave it there with a host of others. It's a useful friend. It'll get in the way rarely, but you'd be surprised how often it works. Here's one of my favorite slides. On the left, we see a termite castle, an Australian termite castle. On the right, we see Gaudi's great church in Barcelona. Very similar structures, both inside and out. They're very similar. They're both artifacts made by living organisms. They are profoundly different When you think of the research and development, the R&D, and the design and construction, the one on the left, of course, was designed by termites. The one on the right by Gaudi. The termites are clueless. There's no boss termite, there's no architect termite. There's a queen termite, but she's not in charge. These are thousands, hundreds of thousands of clueless little operators doing their thing, and they don't even know what they're doing or why. Gaudi, on the other hand, is a paradigmatic, charismatic boss. He's got blueprints and manifestos, and he's got it all worked out in advance. It's a very different sort of top-down design and construction compared with the termite colony. Now, we understand very well nature's way of doing termite-type building. What we need to understand is, how do you get from termite-type design and construction to Gaudi-type design and construction? That's a tall order, particularly because your brain is more like a termite colony than you might at first think. You got billions of neurons, they're each clueless. They don't know Baroque from Rococo. They don't know Barcelona from Cleveland. And yet, you put enough of them together just right, and you get a Gaudi mind, full of comprehension and understanding and vision, seeing ahead, planning ahead. The trick is to see, how can you organize all those neurons to make a Gaudi-type mind? And I think that's one of the reasons that some people say this is just beyond science to discover. I beg to differ. I think we're making great progress on it, and the answer is, it's in the organization of all of those neurons.
Let me interject again. The organization. If you have a plan, the uncertainty, no sweat. If you have a plan, the surprise, you still might be surprised, but when you're surprised, you know what to do. You know how to act. You know how to make a decision. Back to Dan Dennett.
Stan and his colleagues in Paris have literally, I guess, hundreds of experiments which shed light on how the architecture of the human mind is organized in the human brain, but we still have a long way to go. And I would submit, Stan and his colleagues are working on the bare brain. They have hardly touched on the tool-infested brain of you. I mean, although they rely on it all the time, because after all, when you ask a subject to perform a test, when you tell the subject what to do, you're depending on the fact that both you and the subject have language and can comprehend. Basically, when Stan sets up a subject to press the button if you see this, and press this button if you see that, it's creating a little app in that brain which is going to give him evidence about what's going on inside. So now here's the question: how could a Gaudi-like comprehension arise out of this organization of clueless bits? And I think the answer is culture, which relies on cultural evolution, which is not genetic evolution, but is a separate evolutionary process.
As he says that, think back to Anders Ericsson's interview on this podcast and his book, Peak, Deliberate Practice. Back to Dan Dennett.
I want to illustrate the remarkable feature of what I call competence without comprehension. You've all seen the documentaries of the gazelles running away from the cheetahs or the lions and throwing these ridiculous high, beautiful leaps. It's called stotting. People wonder, what's this stotting for? It's very energetic, it's dangerous, they're wasting time, it's not helping them get away from the predator. What are they doing? Well, it's pretty well worked out now. Here's what stotting is. It's costly signaling. The gazelle is saying, look at me. I can throw these ridiculous, expensive, athletic leaps. You still can't catch me. Go after my cousin. He can't do this. And the lions believe him. So the evidence shows that the animals that can stot are seldom predated. It's the ones that aren't strong enough, fast enough to do that expensive activity. They're the ones that get predated. So now look, I've given you the rationale of this. It's a signaling system. It's a communication system between two different species. But here's the important point. The gazelles don't have to understand that. They can be just as clueless as a termite. They don't know why they're stotting. They just have the urge to stot when the lion, if they can, when the lion attacks. And the lion doesn't have to understand why it isn't attracted to the stotting gazelle. It just doesn't seem very attractive as a prey item. It goes after the ones that aren't stotting. Neither the sender nor the receiver has to understand the message for the message to get through. That's a stunning, weird fact. But it's a very important fact because the same thing's true in our brains. Your optic nerve doesn't have to understand what's out there in the world that it's sending information to the visual cortex on. The different parts of your brain, the different collections of neurons can be quite termite-like and still carry information. Well, now, in the case of stotting, what shapes this behavior, what designs this behavior, is genetic evolution. Over the centuries, over the millennia, this communicative behavior has evolved and has been stabilized by the rationale that I mentioned. The same thing has to happen in the brain. In the brain, however, much of the stabilization has to be a case of intracranial evolution. There's no little guys in there that understand. There aren't. They're all quite clueless. But there are evolutionary systems, or quasi-evolutionary systems in the brain which can shape coalitions of neurons to communicate, discriminate, evaluate, and generate decisions, and none of the individuals have to understand at all, and yet comprehension is the result. Thinking tools, we're the only species that really has thinking tools. And the beautiful thing about them is, in effect, they evolved elsewhere. None of you had to invent long division, or language, or arithmetic, or alphabetizing lists, or calculus, or any of the other tools that you may have in your kit. There's no other species that can share knowledge like that. You didn't get it from your grandfather and your great-grandfather and your great-grandmother. You got it from people you never met because it's transmitted by the culture. Analogies are very good thinking tools. I want to give one example. I'm going to tell you about Vim. There's a big argument in consciousness work about whether conscious states have some intrinsic property which defies science, to the end of time. And I've drawn the analogy with the following amusing scenario. A lot of American tourists, they go to Europe, they want to buy something in euros, and they say, "How much is that in real money?" Meaning dollars. They say, in effect, "I don't know how you folks get by with euros. They don't have any intrinsic value. Dollars have intrinsic value. You can just feel it. I mean, I know what a dollar is worth. It's not as worth as much now, but it's intrinsic." And yes, indeed, you can translate euro value into dollar value, but euros themselves have no actual intrinsic economic value. Only dollars have that. Well, we can all see that that's a mistake, right? I think many philosophers, and not just philosophers, some neuroscientists, make the same mistake about consciousness. They say, well, you're giving us all these functional features of events in the brain, but where's the intrinsic qualia, the vim, of the conscious state. And I think they're making the same mistake. It's just more clouded, you might say, harder to see.
Now, some of you might be thinking, Michael, I don't see the point there. And guess what? If you don't see the point there, you are the guy or girl who's on Twitter looking for financial advice, looking for investment advice, trusting some pick from somebody. The whole point of Dan Dennett is clarity of thought, how to think, how to break apart the complex to look at it in its pieces, how to assemble it, and how to know, frankly, the difference between fact and fiction, right and wrong. But if you don't have thinking tools, and in many cases, we are simply talking about math, and math is generally not debated as something good these days, but a hell of a lot of people forget what math is. So I love finding these excerpts with Dan Dennett and bringing them into my world. Because his clarity of thought, that ability to see at that micro granular level, God, if it doesn't inspire you to stay on the right path. I mean, guys like Dan Dennett are the kinds of people that give you confidence to say, I'm on the right path. I don't have to listen to every social media expression from every fucking moron that I can possibly find that thinks he has something to say. Now, you might be saying that about me, but what I try to do is leave a foundation, to leave remnants, to leave pieces, to leave artifacts of where my thinking came from. Because if I have no foundation, I'm just like the same idiot out there on Twitter that I'm criticizing. And I'm proud to say that a guy like Dan Dennett is in my toolbox. He's part of my foundation. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.